Battles of 40k are won and lost in the setup. In this video, I break down the 3 most important things that separate the boys from the grots when it comes to deployment. Hello and welcome to Incursion Events, where today I will be mostly talking about deployment. I'm Luke, and I run wargaming tournaments in the south of England. If you're looking for events in that region, then check out the description below for a link to all that info. I've seen and played countless games of 40k, and I want to share what I've learned. This is the first of a series of videos where I'll chat 40k strategy, so if you like what you hear, subscribe for more. Now, let's get started. First things first, understanding the mission. A proper deployment begins with a thorough grasp of the mission. What are the primary objectives? How many do you need to control to maximise your primary scoring? How many objectives do you need to control to minimise your opponent's primary scoring? Denying what your opponent's going to score is just as important as you scoring points as well. And how well can you hold these primary objectives to ultimately score and deny scoring? Your deployment should be influenced by these primary missions and setting up to control objectives from turn 2 so you can get ahead on that primary early. Units with scout or infiltrate are excellent for this, and you need to consider your opponent's infiltrators and other forward deploying units before you deploy any of your own. If they don't have any, then you can deploy any units with infiltrate that you have last, and that gives you more information on where your opponent has put their army. If your opponent also has infiltrators, then a good tactic, if you got to choose attacker or defender, is to choose to deploy a unit first so that you can begin to claim no man's land and push the enemy infiltrators back into their deployment zone, hindering their ability to claim easy objectives early on. This is also important if you've got units entering play from deep strike. If your opponent's got a unit that can infiltrate into no man's land and they're able to jump in there first, that could seriously limit where your reserves can enter play, as they've already begun to spread out, forcing your reserves units to push back. Infiltrating, making that move into no man's land early on. Ultimately, whatever the texture of the game is looking like it's going to be, you need to be considering the mission objectives and positioning your forces to exert control over key areas. Now, let's talk about adapting your deployment to your army and the army that's going to be sitting across from you. Every faction's got strengths and weaknesses, and these will change depending on what you're facing into. So, what does victory look like in this matchup? Before you deploy a single model, take a moment to envisage how you will win this game against what your opponent has brought to the table. Can you outshoot them? Outfight them? A moment of future framing to understand your path to victory is key. It will help you to answer the question, where do your units need to be so that you can execute that plan and stay on the path to victory? This can take a bit of practice, and we won't always get it right, but forming this habit will inject your deployment with purpose instead of just plonking units on the table and hoping for the best. If you ever find yourself struggling with the question, how do I actually win this game? Because it can be hard to envisage that, especially if you're a bit newer into the hobby. Instead, just think about, how will I lose this game? How will my opponents be using their army to try and beat me? If they've got lots of guns, for example, they're going to be trying to shoot me a lot. So how do I then try to avoid that from happening? Another example might be, okay, my opponent's got a very fast combat army. They're going to be in my face turn 1. Rather than just resigning yourself to that, plopping units down, think about how you can deny scoring whilst keeping them at bay, feeding them units that are expendable, that you don't really care if they die or not exposing your key units, things that might do damage or score you points, to merciless slaughter. Think about how you can rack up points, make them work for it. Your deployment should magnify your army's strengths while mitigating its vulnerabilities against your opponent. Tip number 3 emphasises the importance of terrain in deployment. Once you've started to think about the first 2 points, this is the final piece of the puzzle for you to execute a solid deployment strategy. Identify key pieces of the terrain that align with your overall plan. Deploying units behind cover protects them from enemy guns, obviously, and so terrain that blocks line of sight is going to be instrumental to concealing your army. In other words, hide. All too often I see people set up awesome looking formations worthy of the dioramas at Warhammer World, only to go second and watch them break out the old dustpan and brush as their opponent gleefully mows down chunks of their army in the first turn. Hide your stuff, and hide it properly. Ask your opponents how far their units can move. Can they get an angle on a unit that you've put behind a ruin or not? If your intention is to be out of sight, make that crystal clear and get confirmation that where you deploy behind cover will actually achieve the objective of being hidden even after an enemy movement phase, so you don't just lose key units to a sloppy setup. Nobody likes a sloppy setup. So take a moment just to say, I've put them there. Is there any way you can move in your next turn that you'll be able to see them? Or are they safe? Are we happy that they're safe? Get your opponent to confirm that so you're happy with where you've set stuff up and it makes sense to your game plan. The right deployment behind terrain can make the difference between a massacre and a decisive victory. Staging is massively important also. Whilst you're carefully hiding your army from all those nasty bullets, you also need to be mindful of where you can end up after a movement phase or two as well to get where you need to be. Thinking about the first 2 points again, some places on the board might allow you to leapfrog from ruin to ruin, and measuring distances ahead can help you set up a unit safely with a view to it being where you need it to be to get on objectives or impact the game in some other way. Hiding is great, but you don't want to be cowering at the back of the board, not influencing the game in any meaningful way. Consider the terrain as an extension of your army. It's a toolbox for you to use to your advantage. So, in summary, consider the mission, tailor your deployment to the mission objectives, and strategically position your forces to exert control or threaten control over key areas. Craft a deployment strategy that factors both you and your opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Identify the capabilities of key units, what each faction brings to the battlefield, future frame your path to victory so you can deploy with a solid plan in mind. Utilise terrain. Once you have a plan, assess how the terrain can assist with this in deployment and beyond. As well as hiding, ruins also bottleneck non-infantry and beast units. Are you going to be hampering a unit like a knight by deploying in a certain part of the board, or a vehicle or a monster? You don't want to be reducing how far those key units of yours can move, but you also might want to deploy in a way that might funnel your opponent's units like that into a less desirable part of the board, which is going to slow them down and prevent them getting to where they need to be. And there you have it, your tactical masterclass on deployment. Apply these principles and you will never lose a game again. Maybe. In all seriousness, if you found this useful, please like the video and subscribe to keep up to date with my videos. The next one is going to be all about the movement phase. And if you have any deployment tips or strategies of your own, share them in the comments. Let me know if I've missed out anything important. Until next time, keep rolling those dice. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for more.